You're scrolling through your social media feed on a Tuesday evening. A 23-year-old is launching a startup. A 28-year-old just hit a 7-figure revenue milestone. A 32-year-old has a book deal and a speaking tour lined up. You're 48. Behind you are 25 years of career, a mortgage, responsibilities that accumulate rather than diminish. Somewhere between 35 and 40, the idea took root that the window for real change had simply closed. You tell yourself that's normal. That's how life works. That's what happens after 45. Here's what the neuroscience actually says about that belief. It's fundamentally incorrect. The research is quite specific. Over the past 2 decades, neuroscientists and psychologists studying motivation and achievement have discovered something that contradicts the dominant narrative entirely. People after 45 who create genuine transformation in their lives rarely do it through one dramatic gesture or a complete life overhaul. They do it through a system that operates almost invisibly, so quiet that people around them attribute it to luck. The system is called small wins, and it works in a way that's completely different from anything you've probably attempted before. Small wins aren't just motivational language, they're neurobiology. Every time you complete something specific and meaningful, your brain releases dopamine, the molecule that quite literally prepares your nervous system for the next challenge. That dopamine doesn't just make you feel good in the moment. It rewires the neural pathways connecting your sense of capability to your willingness to take action. One small completion, one hit of dopamine, one piece of evidence that you're capable of change. Then it happens again and again, until something fundamental shifts inside you. There's something even more powerful occurring for you specifically. Something that only becomes possible after 45. Your brain has already shed most of its illusions by this age. You know what actually matters to you because you've lived long enough to distinguish between what the world says should matter and what genuinely does. You've experienced enough failure to know it isn't fatal. You've tasted enough success to understand what it actually feels like. Every small win you create now generates something deeper than dopamine. It provides tangible proof that you're still growing, that you're still capable of change, that your best work might actually lie ahead, not behind you. Teresa Amabile at Harvard spent decades tracking what actually drives human motivation and productivity. She analyzed thousands of journal entries from people doing knowledge work across different industries. What she found was surprising to almost everyone in the field of motivation science. The single strongest predictor of motivation, creativity, and sustained effort wasn't money or recognition or status or even the promise of some massive future payoff. It was the feeling of progress, the sense that you were moving forward, however incrementally. When people felt that progress was happening, their brains lit up with activity. They became creative. They persisted through obstacles. They didn't quit, because they had proof that movement was possible. Most people who want change after 45 are caught between 2 waiting games. They're waiting for perfect conditions, enough money, enough time, enough confidence, enough certainty about whether this will work. Or they're waiting for a lightning bolt moment of inspiration, some external force that transforms them from someone living a life into someone actively creating one. You already know how this ends. Neither of these things happens. The window doesn't suddenly open because conditions aligned perfectly. The lightning bolt doesn't strike because you deserve it. Waiting for these things keeps you exactly where you are. What happens instead is much simpler. A brain genuinely ready for change is a brain that's already experienced its own capability to create change. That evidence doesn't arrive in one massive package. It arrives as a repeating series of tiny completions, each one real, each one meaningful in its own right. That's the system. That's what actually works. Ray Kroc was 52 years old when he opened the first McDonald's franchise. His life story up to that point looked like a string of failures. 6 failed business ventures, years of financial struggle, false starts, and setbacks. Something critical had happened during those decades of failure, though. His brain had been collecting evidence. Every failed business taught him what doesn't work. Every struggle taught him something about persistence. Every experience sharpened his ability to recognize genuine opportunity. When he saw the McDonald's system, something in him knew immediately that this was different. Not because he'd suddenly become a genius businessman, but because he'd spent decades becoming someone who could recognize a real opportunity. Julia Child didn't seriously begin cooking until she was 37 years old. Her first major cookbook wasn't published until she was 51. 3 decades most people would dismiss as wasted time. Decades before she became the person the world remembers. Those decades weren't wasted, though. They were her preparation. Each job she held, each skill she learned, each experience she accumulated was preparing her brain, building her neural networks, creating the conditions where she could step into something and do it at a level most people never reach. By the time she started teaching cooking, her brain was ready in a way that a younger version of her probably wouldn't have been. The actual secret isn't being young or having unlimited resources or natural talent or perfect circumstances. The secret is understanding how your brain actually works after 45, and then consistently giving it what it needs to activate. What neuroscience took 2 decades to figure out. What this audiobook is going to teach you. Here's what you're going to discover in the pages ahead. You'll learn why small wins after 45 work better than any motivation technique you've ever attempted. You'll understand the exact mechanism of how progress creates momentum in your brain. The specific neurological sequence that happens every time you complete something meaningful. You'll discover the psychological advantage that people over 45 possess, that younger people simply don't have. An advantage the world never talks about. An advantage that, once you understand it, becomes your greatest asset. But most importantly, you're getting a concrete, day-by-day, week-by-week approach to building small wins that fits into the actual life you're already living. The one with the job you have, the responsibilities you're carrying, the time constraints that are genuinely real. Not some fantasy version where everything suddenly aligns perfectly. You'll get answers to the questions you're actually scared to ask out loud. How do you find courage to pursue change when your experience has taught you that change is risky? How do you build momentum when part of you knows all the ways this could go wrong? The answer is here, and it doesn't require you to become fearless or to magically eliminate doubt. It requires you to understand how small wins create both safety and momentum at the same time. How they quiet the fear while building evidence that says you can do this. There's no pretense in what you're about to read. No claim that life after 45 is just about positive thinking or finally being happy despite your circumstances. This is about actual change, measurable change. The kind that reshapes not just your external circumstances, but the way you see yourself. The kind that gets built week by week, choice by choice, small win by small win. Until one day you look back and realize that quiet progress added up to something real. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Grand Gesture. The story most people believe about change after 45 goes something like this. One day you wake up and you know. You know that everything has to shift. You know that you can't keep living the way you've been living. And on that day, that pivotal, crystalline day, you make the decision. You quit your job. You move to a new city. You leave the marriage. You start the business. The decision is dramatic. The action is immediate. The transformation begins. Movies are built on this narrative. So is most of the self-help industry. So is the way your friends talk about their midlife pivots, at least in the version they tell at dinner parties. But here's what's interesting. When you actually interview people who made genuine changes after 45, this isn't the story you hear. The story you hear is messier, quieter, less cinematically satisfying, and it's far more effective. What actually happens is this. You don't wake up one day knowing exactly what needs to change. You notice something first. Maybe it's a conversation with someone that lands differently than it would have 10 years ago. Maybe it's a moment where you realize you're not angry about your life. You're just uninspired by it. Maybe it's a physical sensation, a tightness in your chest that says something is out of alignment. You don't act on this immediately. Instead, you sit with it. You notice it more. You start reading about things that relate to it. You mention it casually to someone you trust. And somewhere in that noticing, before you've made any big decision, something has already begun to shift in your brain. Then one day, and this is crucial, you do something small. You take a class. You have a conversation you've been avoiding. You write something down. You spend an afternoon researching something that interests you. This small action doesn't feel like the beginning of your grand transformation. It feels like a normal Tuesday. But neurologically, something significant has just happened. Your brain is wired to follow patterns of success. When you complete something, anything, your nervous system registers it as a win. Your brain releases dopamine. That dopamine doesn't just feel good. It actually reorganizes your neural networks so that you're more likely to take the next action. So the day after you take that class, you're not dramatically more motivated by some mystical force. You're neurologically more inclined to take another step. Not because you've made a grand commitment, but because your brain has evidence that action is possible. This is where the mythology breaks down completely. The myth says you need certainty before you act. You need to know the whole path before you start walking it. You need perfect conditions and absolute clarity and enough resources lined up so that failure isn't possible. The myth says that real transformation comes from one bold move, not from a series of small steps that seem almost insignificant as you're taking them. The actual science says something completely different. And what's fascinating is that this science becomes even more important after 45. When you're younger, you can get away with acting from a place of relative ignorance. You can make a bold move with incomplete information because your brain hasn't yet learned all the ways it could go wrong. You have the kind of confidence that comes from not knowing enough to be truly afraid. After 45, you've lived enough to know that bold moves are risky. You've seen people fail. You've experienced failure yourself. Your brain is smarter now about the potential consequences, which means that waiting for perfect conditions feels safer. It feels more prudent. It feels like wisdom. But here's what actually happens when you wait for perfect conditions. You're waiting for your nervous system to tell you that it's safe to proceed. And your nervous system, the part of you that's been shaped by decades of real experience, is going to take a very long time to say that. Because it's learned what's actually at stake. It knows you have a mortgage now. It knows you have people depending on you. It knows that failure looks different at 50 than it did at 25. So it keeps saying, not yet. Not quite ready. Wait a little longer. The only way to interrupt this pattern is not to make a bigger commitment or to psych yourself up harder or to wait until you feel absolutely certain. The only way is to give your nervous system evidence that small steps are survivable. That you can take action without gambling everything. That progress doesn't require you to blow up your entire life. And the moment you do this, The moment you complete something small and your brain registers it as real, something shifts. Your nervous system starts to believe that change is possible without catastrophe. And that belief is what actually enables genuine transformation. Think about what happens in your body right now when you imagine making a major change. Your chest might tighten. Your mind might race through all the obstacles. Your stomach might clench. This isn't weakness. This is your nervous system doing its job, keeping you safe based on everything it's learned about risk. But when you take a small step and complete it successfully, you're teaching your nervous system something new. You're giving it evidence that contradicts the fear. You're not eliminating the fear. You're building something stronger than the fear. You're building proof. This is why people after 45 who achieve real change often look back and say something like, "I didn't realize how much I wanted this until I started doing it." The reason they didn't realize it is because they were waiting to feel the big motivation first. They were waiting for the lightning bolt. What they actually needed was to start moving and let the movement create the motivation, rather than waiting for the motivation to create the movement. Here's a practical reality that almost nobody talks about. If you're thinking about change after 45, you're probably already doing small versions of it without recognizing that's what you're doing. You're reading articles about it. You're having conversations about it. You're noticing when other people do it. Your brain is already collecting data. The question isn't whether you should take a big, bold step tomorrow. The question is whether you're going to notice what your brain is already doing and build on it, or whether you're going to keep waiting for that mythical moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. The real beginning of change, after 45, isn't the dramatic moment. It's the moment when you realize that the small steps you're already considering, the class, the conversation, the project, the change in routine, these aren't insignificant warm-ups to the real change. These are the change. This is what actual transformation looks like when you're over 45 and you have real responsibilities and real knowledge of what's at stake. It's quiet. It's incremental. It doesn't make a good movie trailer. But it works in a way that grand gestures rarely do. The mythology of the grand gesture is comforting because it absolves you of responsibility for small choices. If you're waiting for the moment when everything changes at once, then today's choices don't matter that much. But the moment you understand that change happens through accumulation, through small wins that compound and build momentum, everything changes about how you approach today. Suddenly, the small choice matters. Suddenly, noticing your interest in something matters. Suddenly, taking that one small step matters, because it's not separate from your transformation. It is your transformation. Chapter 2. The compound effect after 45. When you're 25 years old, someone tells you about compound interest, and it sounds beautiful in theory, but distant in practice. You have 40 or 50 years ahead of you for small amounts to grow exponentially, which sounds wonderful until you realize you're also undisciplined, uncertain about what actually matters, and more often than not working on the wrong things entirely. The promise is there, but the execution is scattered across too many competing interests and too much time to really feel urgent. When you're 45, something completely different happens. You have less time ahead, perhaps 20 or 30 years depending on where you stand. But what you've gained is something far more valuable than extra decades. You have clarity about what genuinely deserves to compound. This shift in understanding changes everything about how small wins actually work for you after 45. Every year of personal development you've already survived has eliminated certain possibilities and illuminated others with startling clarity. You know what fulfillment actually feels like because you've experienced it in real moments, not just imagined it from self-help books. You know what meaninglessness feels like too, because you've endured it for long enough to recognize the difference between a temporary low and a genuine misalignment with your own values. This accumulated knowledge means that when you start a small habit or pursue a small win after 45, you're not starting from a place of theoretical hope and untested assumptions. You're starting from knowledge earned through actual living. The mechanics of how momentum compounds in your brain have specific neurological roots that become even more powerful at this stage of life. When you complete a small task, perhaps you spend focused time on a project that matters to you, or you have a difficult conversation with someone important, or you learn one new skill in an area you've been curious about. Your brain doesn't just feel satisfied in the moment. It releases dopamine, which is the molecule that creates what neuroscientists call a readiness state for the next action. Your brain literally becomes more likely to attempt the next step forward because the previous step was appropriately calibrated to your current capability and produced a tangible result. This is why the decision to start something genuinely matters more than the decision to finish it. Because if you start something that's properly sized to what you can actually accomplish right now, you're almost mathematically guaranteed to get the neurological reward that makes the next step feel natural and organic, rather than forced and artificial. Here's what makes this different after 45. You're not compounding discipline with chaos the way you might have in your 20s. You're compounding intentional choice with accumulated wisdom. Your previous failures, and you've had some, that's simply part of living this long, have actually taught you something substantive rather than just punishing you emotionally. They've shown you patterns. They've shown you what your own limits actually are versus what you merely believed them to be. Your successes have shown you what's genuinely possible in your own life, not just for other people whose circumstances seem mysteriously different from yours. When you apply this to a system of small wins, something remarkable happens. Consider what happens when someone in their 50s decides to learn an instrument they've always been curious about. A younger person might also take up the violin, but their brain is approaching it differently. They're gathering information somewhat randomly. They're checking it against fantasies of what they might become. They're uncertain whether this should be a serious pursuit or a casual hobby. Someone at 50 approaches it with a completely different neural framework. They've already lived enough to know whether they actually like practicing difficult things, or whether they just like the idea of it. They know whether they have the patience for incremental improvement, or whether they need more immediate gratification. They've tasted enough failure to know that starting something new and being temporarily bad at it is survivable. This means that their small wins, each practice session, each piece learned, each moment where muscle memory clicks into place, compound differently. They compound into genuine skill at a rate that can surprise even the learner themselves. Life circumstances actually shift in ways that support compounding after 45, though most people don't notice this advantage. Your energy levels are different. And yes, they're different in some ways that create real challenges, but they're also different in ways that are genuinely powerful. You likely have more resources available to you than you did in your 20s. You have authority in some areas of your life that younger people are still fighting to establish. You have relationships that are deeper and more resilient. You have patterns you understand about yourself. Which ones energize you and which ones drain you? Which environments bring out your best work and which ones suppress it? Momentum after 45 compounds differently because you're not just stacking small wins on top of random habits. You're stacking intentional choice on top of hard-won knowledge about yourself. The historical record is filled with examples that illuminate this principle with unusual clarity. Ray Kroc spent decades working in various business roles before he encountered McDonald's at 52 years old. Those decades weren't wasted time before the real story began. They were his compounding period. Each failed business taught him something about what doesn't work. Each financial struggle taught him something about the relationship between systems and sustainability. Every experience sharpened his ability to recognize genuine opportunity when it appeared. When he actually saw the McDonald's franchise system, something in his nervous system recognized immediately that this was different from his previous attempts. Not because he'd suddenly become a genius businessman, but because he'd spent decades becoming someone who could recognize a real opportunity in the midst of all the false ones. Julia Child spent years working in government before she discovered cooking seriously in her late 30s. Those years weren't a prelude to her real life. They were building her. Each job taught her about organization, about how to work within systems, about how people actually operate in groups. When she finally committed to the Cordon Bleu school in Paris and then spent years developing her cookbook, all of that previous experience materialized in her work. She brought something to cooking that someone half her age probably couldn't have brought. A combination of maturity, organizational skill, and the kind of patience that only comes from having lived long enough to know that some things are worth the time they require. By the time she began teaching cooking, her brain had been preparing for this moment through a decade of seemingly unrelated experiences. What psychologists call socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests something fascinating about how aging changes what you naturally focus on and invest in. After 45, you don't become less motivated. Your motivation simply becomes more selective. You naturally start filtering out pursuits that don't align with what you've learned actually matters to you. This sounds like a limitation, but it's actually one of your greatest assets when it comes to building momentum. You're not compounding wins in random directions anymore. You're compounding wins specifically in areas that create genuine satisfaction and meaning for you. This selectivity is a feature, not a bug. It means your small wins are more likely to be in service of something that touches your real values rather than something you think you should care about. The hidden advantage that almost nobody talks about is this: your neuroplasticity. Your brain's ability to form new connections and learn genuinely new things doesn't actually decrease as dramatically as popular culture suggests. What changes is far more interesting than simple decline. You can direct your neuroplasticity more intelligently now. You're not learning randomly. You're learning strategically, in service of something you actually want to build. This creates a different quality of learning entirely. The skills you develop after 45 stick differently because you're not just absorbing information. You're integrating new knowledge into existing frameworks of understanding that you've spent decades constructing. This integration actually creates deeper, more durable competence than the kind of learning you might have done younger. Here's what becomes possible when you truly understand the compound effect after 45. You stop waiting for everything to be ready before you begin. You begin small, you notice what compounds, and you build on what works. This isn't permission to be reckless. It's permission to be strategic with your time and energy in a way that honors both your limitations and your genuine capabilities. The compound effect doesn't require you to change everything at once. It requires you to change one small thing deliberately, and then notice what happens when you do. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Deliberate Progress. Not all small wins are created equal, and this is a critical distinction that most people miss entirely when they first encounter the concept. You could theoretically complete dozens of small actions throughout your week and find yourself feeling worse at the end of it. Not because you failed, but because you succeeded in completing things that were never truly aligned with what matters to you. You could cross items off your list with perfect efficiency and still feel empty because you were doing it all in service of someone else's vision of progress. You could achieve a goal you'd been working toward for months and then immediately spiral into doubt about whether the goal was ever worth achieving in the first place. The difference between these scenarios and genuine progress lies in something that's easy to miss. Whether your small wins are directed by your own values or whether they're accidental byproducts of busyness. There's a psychological distinction that researchers have studied extensively between random small wins and deliberately constructed ones. When you complete something by accident, you stumbled into an opportunity, you had free time and filled it productively. Circumstances aligned and you took advantage. The satisfaction is typically temporary and shallow. Your brain logs the experience as "nice thing that happened to me," rather than evidence that I can make things happen. But when you deliberately construct a small win, you plan it with intention, you commit to it knowing what it costs, you execute it despite obstacles, you complete it because you chose to. Your brain processes this completely differently. This registers as agency. This registers as capability. This is the neurological difference between passive luck and active choice. The reason this matters so profoundly after 45 is that your brain has already accumulated decades of evidence about what's within your control and what isn't. You've experienced enough situations to know the difference between trying your best at something and actually creating an outcome. You've lived long enough to recognize when you're genuinely growing versus when you're just going through motions. So when you deliberately achieve something you explicitly set out to achieve, when you follow through on a commitment you made to yourself, your brain activates the same neural pathways involved in decision-making and executive function. It's not just dopamine flooding your system. It's a deeper sense of self-efficacy, a growing confidence that you can actually influence your own life and shape your own circumstances. Albert Bandura, the psychologist who developed the concept of self-efficacy, spent decades researching what actually builds genuine confidence in one's own abilities. What he discovered was counterintuitive to how most people think about motivation and belief. Confidence doesn't come primarily from thinking positive thoughts, or from affirmations, or from intellectual understanding that you're capable. Confidence comes from having actual evidence of your capability. Each small win you deliberately achieve becomes a piece of evidence, and over time, this evidence accumulates into something that can't be argued with. It becomes your lived experience that you're capable of creating change. After 45, when you've probably heard enough positive affirmations to last a lifetime, and you're naturally skeptical of them, this kind of evidence-based confidence becomes your actual foundation. Here's what actually distinguishes a real small win from something that just looks like one. A genuine small win has very specific characteristics that need to be present simultaneously. It requires real effort from you, not so much that it becomes overwhelming, but enough that completing it means something. It's specific and measurable rather than vague or abstract, which means you can actually know when you've done it. It's genuinely in service of something you value rather than something you think you should value or something someone else wants you to value. It happens within a defined time frame rather than being some ongoing, nebulous goal. And it produces a result you can actually recognize and acknowledge, not something that requires you to squint and pretend you've made progress when you haven't. To make this concrete and useful, "I'll be more productive tomorrow" is not a small win, even though it sounds like something you might pursue. It's too vague. How will you measure productivity? What does it actually mean? When have you succeeded? Instead, "I'll work on my project for 2 focused hours tomorrow morning before I check email" is a small win. It's specific, it's measurable, it's bounded by time. You'll know whether you did it. "I'll be healthier" is not a small win for the same reason. Too abstract and impossible to know when you've actually achieved it. But "I'll take a 20-minute walk before lunch 4 days this week" is a small win. "I'll improve my relationship with my partner" is not a small win because it's too large and lacks clear criteria for success. But "I'll have one meaningful conversation with my partner where I ask about something I don't already know about their day." Not just "how was work," but something specific that shows I'm genuinely curious is a small win. You can do it. You'll know whether you did it. Your brain will register it as real. There's something that sounds counterintuitive when you first hear it, but it becomes obvious once you understand the neurobiology. Most people do the small win correctly, and then completely erase the psychological benefit by failing to acknowledge it. You achieve something, you check it off your mental list, and you immediately shift your attention to the next thing without actually letting your brain register the success. This is especially common after 45, where many of us were raised with the belief that celebrating small things is somehow immature or self-indulgent. Only big achievements count, the logic goes. Only final products matter. Only success that other people can see deserves acknowledgement. But neurologically, this erases the primary mechanism through which small wins actually work. You're depriving your brain of the dopamine signal that makes the next action feel natural rather than forced and difficult. This is where something as simple as journaling becomes remarkably powerful. Not as a journaling practice in the self-help sense, but specifically as a way of forcing your own conscious awareness of what you've accomplished. When you write down what you achieved, your brain has to process it consciously rather than just moving past it. You're forcing yourself to acknowledge your own capability. You're creating a record that contradicts the voice in your head that says you're not making progress. This is a form of self-reinforcement that's far more powerful than just doing the things silently and moving on. Your brain needs you to notice. It needs you to acknowledge. It needs evidence that you can point to, not just memories that might fade. There's also something about timing and pace that matters significantly when you're building a system of small wins after 45. You're not trying to build momentum so fast that you burn out or overwhelm your life and your real responsibilities. You're trying to build momentum that's actually sustainable for the next 2 or 3 decades. This means calibrating your small wins appropriately. If you achieve small wins too frequently, if every single day has to be a win or you feel like you're failing, then you're turning the system into another source of stress and judgment. If you space them too far apart, you lose the momentum, and the evidence accumulates too slowly to actually shift your sense of what's possible. The research suggests that for most people after 45, the sweet spot is somewhere between 1 and 3 small wins per week in your target area, depending on the demands of the rest of your life and the complexity of what you're pursuing. Chapter 4. The Myth of Readiness and Permission. There's a specific moment that happens to most people after 45, and if you're paying attention to yourself, you'll probably recognize it. You achieve a small win. Maybe you take that class, or you have the conversation you've been avoiding, or you spend real time on something that matters to you. You feel momentum building. You can sense something shifting inside you. And then, in that moment of forward motion, you find a reason to wait, to prepare more, to get ready, to make absolutely sure conditions are perfect before you proceed further. This moment, when you're on the edge of real progress and you talk yourself into waiting, this is where most people lose momentum entirely. The waiting trap looks reasonable from the outside. It looks like wisdom. It looks like prudence. You tell yourself that you need more information before you act. You need to finish the online course before you really start. You need to have enough money saved up before you make the transition. You need to understand the full picture before you commit. But what's actually happening is something different. You've created what I call the perpetual preparation phase, and it's one of the most effective ways to guarantee that nothing actually changes. Here's what this looks like in real life. You're interested in a career shift, so you start reading books about it. That becomes research, which becomes taking courses, which becomes planning, which becomes more research. Months pass. Years pass. You're reading, you're learning, you're preparing, and you're not actually doing the thing. This isn't laziness. This is a specific form of fear that becomes more common after 45. And understanding it changes everything. It's the fear that if you start and fail, it will prove something terrible about you at an age when you're supposed to know better. So instead of risking that proof, you prepare. Because preparation feels productive. Preparation feels safe. Preparation keeps you in the zone of possibility rather than the zone of failure. But here's what the research on actual progress shows. There's a clear point at which preparation stops helping and starts actively harming your progress. You're no longer gathering information. You're gathering permission. You're waiting for external validation that it's finally time to start. You're hoping that one more course or one more book or one more conversation will be the thing that suddenly makes you feel ready. But readiness, the way most people experience it, was never supposed to arrive as a feeling. Readiness is a decision you make while terrified. After 45, this becomes even more nuanced because you're usually operating in environments where other people's permission doesn't matter as much as it did when you were younger. You have authority in your own life. You can theoretically do what you want. But this is where internalized permission becomes the real issue. You need permission from yourself. And most of us learned somewhere in our past, probably unconsciously, that we don't deserve that kind of permission unless certain conditions have been met. Until we're certain enough. Until we've prepared enough. Until we've proven something first. Think carefully about what you actually believe about yourself in terms of starting something new after 45. Not what you tell people you believe. Not what sounds good when you say it out loud. What do you genuinely believe in the part of you that makes decisions? Do you believe you're the kind of person who can learn new things? Or have you decided that window closed at 35? Do you believe you're capable of handling the discomfort of being a beginner again? Or have you convinced yourself that you're too experienced to fumble through a learning curve? These beliefs, the ones you don't often articulate, are often the actual limiting factor, not your circumstances, not your age, not your resources, your internal narrative about what's possible for someone like you. The research on neuroplasticity and aging is remarkably clear on this point. You absolutely can learn new things after 45. Your brain retains the capacity to form new neural connections well into old age. What changes isn't the fundamental capability. It's the speed might be slightly different, and the way you learn might need to be adjusted. But the underlying capacity is intact and functional. In fact, people after 45 often learn more deeply than younger people because they bring more context to what they're learning and they're more intentional about what deserves their cognitive resources. You're not just absorbing information randomly. You're integrating new knowledge into existing frameworks of understanding that you've spent decades constructing. The permission issue resolves itself in a particular way once you understand it. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need to wait for certainty. You need to do something small enough that you can survive it. And then notice what happens. Ray Kroc didn't feel ready to franchise McDonald's at 52. He had legitimate reasons to believe it might not work. He'd failed at multiple ventures before this one. But he moved forward anyway. Not because he became fearless, but because he understood that the risk of trying was smaller than the risk of spending the rest of his life wondering what might have happened. The permission came from action, not from preparation. This is what shifts everything. When you take that first small step, when you finally enroll in the class instead of researching classes, when you finally write the email instead of planning what the email should say, when you finally reach out to the person instead of perfecting your opening line, something fundamental changes. Your nervous system gets evidence that you can take action without catastrophe. You can try something without everything collapsing. You can be imperfect and survive it. And that evidence is what actually gives you permission to keep going. Not confidence, not certainty, but evidence. Chapter 5. Wisdom, your secret weapon. After 45, something shifts in how your brain processes information and makes decisions. And this shift is one of your greatest advantages if you know how to use it. In your 20s, you were considered young and therefore inexperienced. But you compensated for that with raw energy and a kind of confidence that comes from not yet understanding all the ways things could go wrong. After 45, you've traded that energy for something more valuable: wisdom. And the research on wisdom and its actual impact on mental health and quality of life shows that this trade-off is far more favorable than most people realize. What psychologists call socio-emotional selectivity theory describes something specific about how motivation and attention naturally shift as you move through middle age and beyond. After 45, you don't become less motivated. Instead, your motivation becomes deliberately selective about where you invest your energy and attention. What might look like limitation from the outside is actually one of your most powerful assets when you're building a system of small wins. You're filtering out pursuits that don't align with what you've genuinely learned matters to you over decades of actual living. This filtering process isn't a narrowing, it's a focusing. It means your small wins are specifically in service of things that create genuine satisfaction rather than things you believe you should care about. Think about what decades of living have actually taught you that a younger person simply doesn't know yet. You understand the difference between short-term satisfaction and long-term fulfillment, because you've experienced both and can recognize the distinction when you're making choices. You know what genuine friendship actually requires because you've maintained relationships through changes and challenges. You understand what real commitment looks like because you've kept promises even when circumstances made them difficult. You know which kinds of struggle are worth enduring and which ones are just suffering without meaning. This accumulated knowledge is wisdom, and it becomes your compass for where to direct your small wins. Ray Kroc's decades of business failures weren't wasted time before the real story began. They were his wisdom-building period. Each failed venture taught him something about systems and human nature, and the difference between a genuinely viable idea and a hopeful fantasy. When he encountered McDonald's at 52 years old, he could recognize immediately what others couldn't see because his brain had spent decades collecting information about what actually works and what doesn't. Julia Child's years in government and various jobs weren't a prelude to her real life. They were building her brain's framework for understanding organization and human dynamics, and the kind of patience that comes from having lived long enough to know that some things require time. By the time she committed to cooking, her brain had accumulated the wisdom to know that this was genuinely worth the effort. Here's something that neuroscience has discovered about wisdom specifically. It's not the same as intelligence, and it doesn't decline the way some cognitive functions do with aging. Wisdom actually involves your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for judgment and perspective, working together with your emotional centers in ways that create deeper understanding. After 45, your brain has had decades to develop these connections. You can hold contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately. You can see multiple perspectives on a situation without losing your own sense of what matters. You can understand why someone is doing something you disagree with, without needing to judge them for it. This capacity for nuanced thinking is wisdom, and it's a direct result of having lived long enough to see that reality is more complex than any simple story. The practical advantage this gives you in building momentum after 45 is substantial but often overlooked. When you're designing your small wins, your wisdom helps you choose ones that are actually aligned with what matters rather than ones that just look impressive or sound good. You're not pursuing small wins to prove something to other people. You've already figured out that external validation is unreliable and temporary. You're pursuing small wins in service of your own genuine goals, which means they're more likely to sustain your interest and effort over time. This alignment between your goals and your actual values creates a different quality of motivation entirely. It's not forced. It's not desperate. It's grounded in real understanding. Additionally, wisdom gives you realistic expectations about what change actually requires. You're not expecting overnight transformation because you've lived long enough to know that meaningful change takes time. You're not surprised when progress isn't linear because you've experienced enough situations to know that things rarely move in straight lines. You understand that setbacks are part of the process rather than signs that you're doing it wrong. These realistic expectations actually reduce the kind of discouragement that derails people younger than you. When you hit an obstacle, your decades of experience tell you that obstacles are normal, that they're survivable, and that they often contain useful information about what you need to adjust. There's also something about the relationship between wisdom and self-compassion that becomes critical after 45. You've probably made mistakes. You've probably taken wrong turns. You've probably done things you wish you could undo. Most people have by this age. And if you've survived long enough to get here, you've also probably learned that holding yourself accountable doesn't require hating yourself. You can recognize your mistakes and still treat yourself with basic decency. This capacity for honest self-assessment without cruelty is wisdom, and it's essential when you're building a system of small wins. Because when you don't achieve a small win you intended, or when you fall back into old patterns, or when life disrupts your plans, you need the ability to notice what happened and adjust without spiraling into shame. The secret that most people don't realize is that wisdom is your actual competitive advantage after 45. It's what makes your small wins more durable. It's what makes your goals more aligned with your actual values. It's what keeps you moving forward even when circumstances get messy. You're not competing with younger people on energy or speed or the ability to absorb new information quickly. You're competing on judgment, on understanding what actually matters, on the capacity to persist at something meaningful even when the path isn't clear. And those are the qualities that actually determine whether someone builds lasting change or just experiences another false start. Chapter 6. Fear becomes your compass. After 45, you often experience a deeper and more complex kind of fear than you might have felt when you were younger. And this shift is worth understanding rather than dismissing. When you're younger, fear often feels like a simple warning signal. Danger ahead, proceed with caution or don't proceed at all. But after 45, fear becomes layered. You're not just afraid of failure itself. You're afraid of what failure means at this stage of your life. You're afraid of disappointing people who depend on you. You're afraid of wasting time you can't get back. You're afraid of proving wrong the person you've become. This deeper fear isn't weakness. It's actually the result of having lived long enough to understand what's genuinely at stake in your choices. Here's something that changes the relationship with fear entirely once you understand it. Fear is often pointing you toward something that matters. When you feel afraid of taking a small step toward something, that fear frequently means the step has genuine significance for you. It means you're not just playing around with an idea. You're considering something that would actually change something about your life. The things that genuinely don't matter to us don't usually trigger fear. We can ignore them. We can dismiss them. We can move past them without our nervous system raising any alarms. But the things that matter, the things that touch something real in us, those activate fear because your brain recognizes that the outcome actually affects you. This means that your fear becomes useful information if you learn to read it correctly. Instead of interpreting fear as a stop sign, you can interpret it as a signal that you're pointed toward something worth examining more closely. Someone in their late 40s who feels afraid about pursuing a creative project they've always been curious about might interpret that fear as evidence that they shouldn't try. But they could also interpret it as evidence that this project actually matters to them. That it's not just a passing curiosity, but something that touches something real inside them. The fear isn't saying don't do this. The fear is saying this is real enough to be scary. The fear is saying this actually matters to you. There's a neuroscientist named Bessel van der Kolk who has spent decades studying how fear actually works in the human nervous system, particularly in adults who've accumulated years of experience. What he found is that people who've lived longer often have more sophisticated fear responses because their brains have learned to recognize genuine threats more accurately. Your fear responses after 45 aren't hair-trigger reactions. They're calibrated by decades of actual experience. When your body sends you a fear signal, it's based on information your brain has collected over years of living. This means your fear is actually smarter than you might think. It's not just reacting to surface-level threats. It's responding to patterns your brain has learned to recognize. The critical piece that most people miss is that you don't need to eliminate fear in order to move forward. You don't need to become fearless. You don't need to reach some state of absolute courage where fear disappears. What you actually need is the capacity to feel fear and move forward anyway. This is different from not feeling afraid. It's feeling afraid and doing it anyway. And this capacity actually grows stronger through practice, not through waiting until you feel ready. Each time you take a step forward despite fear, even a small step, even a hesitant step, even a step where you're shaking the whole time, you're teaching your nervous system that fear is survivable. You're building evidence that fear doesn't actually mean danger. Think about what happens inside your body right now when you imagine making a meaningful change in your life. Your chest might tighten. Your mind might race through all the obstacles and ways it could go wrong. Your stomach might clench. Your breathing might become shallow. This isn't a sign that you shouldn't proceed. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it's supposed to do, keeping you alert and prepared for something important. But what most people do is interpret these physical signals as evidence that the situation is dangerous, when they're actually just signals that something meaningful is happening. You're not in danger. You're in activation. Here's the practical reality that changes everything. When you take a small step forward despite fear and complete it successfully, you're teaching your nervous system something new. You're giving it evidence that contradicts the fear. You're not magically eliminating the fear. You're building something stronger than the fear. You're building proof. Each small win despite fear becomes a piece of evidence that your nervous system can point to and say, "We did this before, and it was survivable, and it actually mattered." This accumulation of evidence is what actually creates the shift from paralyzed by fear to able to move despite fear. The relationship between fear and momentum after 45 becomes your secret advantage if you understand it correctly. Younger people sometimes avoid fear by pursuing things that don't actually matter enough to be scary. They can move quickly because they're not moving toward anything that touches something real in them. But after 45, when you move forward in the direction of something that matters, something genuine, something that would actually change how you see yourself, of course you're afraid. The fear is appropriate. The fear is correct. The fear is the price of doing something real. And learning to move forward anyway, with the fear present, is what builds genuine momentum and genuine change. Chapter 7. Identity is not fixed. There's a powerful belief that settles into most people's minds somewhere around 45. And it's so pervasive that it feels like truth rather than belief. This belief says that you are who you are. Your job is your identity now. Your role as a parent or a partner or a professional is fixed. The person you've become by 45 is essentially the person you're going to be for the rest of your life. Small adjustments might happen. But fundamental transformation is something that happens to other people. People younger than you. People with different circumstances. People who somehow have permission you don't have. But this belief about identity being fixed is neurologically incorrect. Your identity remains plastic throughout your entire life. This isn't just optimistic thinking. It's a straightforward fact about how brains work. The neural networks that create your sense of self, your understanding of what you're capable of, your beliefs about who you are. These networks continue to reorganize throughout your life based on the experiences you have and the choices you make. What changes after 45 isn't whether your identity can shift. It's how you choose the information and experiences that shape your identity. You become more selective about what you allow into your sense of self. You have more power over the narrative. Think about what's actually happening when someone says, "I'm not a creative person," or "I'm not someone who can learn languages," or "I'm not the kind of person who starts new projects." These statements sound like descriptions of fixed reality. But they're actually descriptions of a narrative you've been telling yourself based on limited evidence. Someone might have tried to draw once when they were 12, been told they weren't good at it, and then spent 40 years collecting evidence to support that identity. But that identity was never fixed. It was just reinforced through repetition and through a lack of contradicting experiences. The moment you actually practice drawing regularly and produce something you're proud of, something shifts neurologically. Your brain has to integrate this new evidence into your sense of who you are. After 45, you have something that works in your favor. You've already lived long enough to know that some of your identities are actually chosen rather than inherent. You weren't always a parent. That identity arrived at a specific moment. You weren't always a professional in your field. That too arrived as a choice and then solidified through repetition. You weren't always married or single or independent or connected to your community. These identities were built through decisions and then reinforced through living them. Understanding that your identities were built means you can understand that other identities can be built too. The mechanism through which identity actually shifts is more concrete than most people realize. Each time you take an action that contradicts your old identity, you create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a mismatch between your self-concept and your actual behavior. Your brain doesn't like this mismatch, so it works to resolve it. Usually that resolution happens in one of two directions. Either you abandon the new behavior and return to your old identity, or you update your identity to match the new behavior. Which direction you move depends largely on how much evidence accumulates on the side of the new behavior. which is exactly why small wins become so powerful for identity shift. Each small win in a new direction is a piece of evidence. And when enough evidence accumulates, your brain reorganizes your sense of self to match the evidence. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone decides at 48 that they want to be someone who writes. They're not a writer. They've never been a writer. But they commit to writing for 30 minutes, 3 times a week. Nothing grand. Nothing published. Just writing. After 2 weeks, they've written 6 times. After a month, they've written 12 times. After 3 months, they've written 48 times. At some point during this accumulation, something shifts in how they think about themselves. They start to notice themselves thinking, "I'm someone who writes," rather than, "I'm trying to become a writer." The identity has reorganized around the evidence of behavior. Samuel L. Jackson worked in theater for years before he got his first substantial film role at 43. He was an actor. He'd been acting for years. But he was a stage actor, not a film actor. That was his identity. When opportunities in film started coming, he could have maintained his old identity and turned them down, staying in theater where he already had an established sense of self. Instead, he took the film roles. He built evidence that contradicted his old identity as a theater-only actor and supported a new identity as a film actor. Each role was a small win in a new direction. Each one shifted his sense of what was possible for him. By the time he became the prolific film actor the world knows, his identity had completely reorganized. The practical advantage this gives you after 45 is substantial. You're not stuck being the person you were at 35. You're not locked into the identity you've been performing for 2 decades. Every small win you build in a new direction is literally reshaping your neural networks and your sense of self. When you practice something new and complete it, your brain doesn't just register the accomplishment. It registers evidence about who you are. You're not just learning a skill, you're becoming someone different. And that identity shift is what makes subsequent action feel natural rather than forced. This is why the system of small wins becomes so powerful for genuine identity transformation after 45. You're not trying to convince yourself through affirmations that you're someone different. You're building evidence through actual behavior. Your brain can't argue with evidence. It has to reorganize around it. Each small win you complete is a neural event that reshapes your sense of self. Small enough that it's achievable. Concrete enough that it creates real evidence. Repeated enough that the evidence accumulates. And the accumulation is what creates the transformation that feels natural and real, rather than forced and temporary. Chapter 8. The System of Small Wins in Real Life. All of this theory about small wins and momentum and how your brain responds to progress is intellectually interesting. But the real question is practical and immediate. How does this actually work in the life you're already living? Between the job that demands your attention, the relationships that require your presence and energy, the financial obligations that can't be ignored, and the health concerns or family dynamics or household responsibilities that consume your time in ways you can't simply dismiss or reschedule, your life is already full. This isn't the theoretical life of someone with unlimited resources and no competing demands. This is your actual life, the one that's already complicated. So the real question becomes, how does a system of small wins fit into reality rather than becoming another thing you feel guilty about not doing? The answer is simpler than most people expect. You don't add things. You replace them. You take the life you're already living, not the life you wish you had, not the life that would be perfect if circumstances aligned differently. And you identify places where small wins can be embedded into what's already happening, This is where the system becomes sustainable, rather than becoming another temporary motivation that evaporates when real life gets in the way. Start by looking at your actual calendar and your actual energy patterns, rather than imagining ideal circumstances. When are you already somewhat focused and capable? Maybe it's early morning before your household wakes up. Maybe it's the 30-minute window between when you leave work and when you need to be home. Maybe it's Saturday mornings or Wednesday evenings. These aren't the most ideal times. They're the times that actually exist in your life right now. This is where your first small win lives. Not in some fantasy time that doesn't exist. In the time that's actually available. The next step is identifying what you're willing to replace, rather than what you're going to add on top of everything else. Most people fail at systems because they try to add one more thing to an already overloaded schedule. But you could replace 30 minutes of social media scrolling with 30 minutes of working on something that matters to you. You could replace one television show with one meaningful conversation, or one session of focused work, or one walk that's actually attentive rather than just movement. You could replace 1 hour of vague busyness with 1 hour of deliberate progress. This replacement approach works because you're not increasing your total time commitment. You're redirecting time that's already happening. Once you've identified the time and decided what you're replacing, the small win itself needs to be concrete enough that you can actually complete it. Not work on my project, but spend the next 45 minutes developing the outline for Chapter 3, or research 3 specific things I need to know about this topic. Not get healthier, but take a 30-minute walk and bring my journal so I can think through something that's been on my mind. Not improve my skills, but complete one lesson from that online course and write down one thing I learned. The specificity matters because it makes completion actually possible. Your brain needs to know when it has succeeded. Here's what becomes possible when you build a system this way. You're not fighting against your actual life. You're working with it. You're not trying to become someone with unlimited time and energy. You're trying to become someone who makes different choices about how to spend the time and energy you actually have. This alignment between the system and your real circumstances is what makes it sustainable. You're not waiting for conditions to improve. You're not holding back until you have more time. You're working with what's actually true right now. Morgan Freeman spent 30 years working in theater, while also holding other jobs that paid his bills and allowed him to support his family. He wasn't waiting for the right time to pursue acting. He was integrating his acting practice into his real life, which included needing to earn money and meet other responsibilities. Each role, each small win in his craft, happened in the margins of a life that was already full. He wasn't a dramatic overnight success. He was someone who showed up consistently to his craft within the constraints of his actual circumstances. And that consistency in the margins eventually created the foundation for something larger. The system also needs flexibility built into it from the beginning, because life is going to interrupt you. You're going to get sick. Someone you care about is going to need you. Work is going to demand more than usual. A crisis will happen. These aren't signs that the system has failed. They're signs that you're alive. The question isn't whether disruptions will happen. The question is what you do when they do. And this is where understanding the system becomes crucial. When you get disrupted, you don't restart at full intensity. You restart at a micro level. Maybe it's just 15 minutes instead of 45. Maybe it's just one small action instead of the full routine. The goal is to maintain connection with your small wins practice, rather than abandoning it entirely and starting from zero. Think about what happens after a major disruption. Illness, loss, a period where everything demanded your attention. Most systems fail here because people expect to return to exactly where they were before the disruption. But what actually works is restarting at a smaller scale, reestablishing the connection, and then gradually rebuilding. One small win in the next 2 days. Then another. Not an attempt to catch up or make up for lost time. Just a gentle reestablishment of the practice. This is how systems become sustainable long-term rather than becoming another thing you tried once and then abandoned. Chapter 9. When you get stuck and how to begin again. You're going to begin. You're going to find your rhythm with small wins. You're going to feel momentum building, and you're going to think that this time, finally, something is actually changing. And then something happens. A crisis arrives. Someone you care about gets sick. Your work suddenly demands more than usual. You get injured or depressed or overwhelmed by something you didn't see coming. Life, in other words, shows up and interrupts everything you've been building. The question that determines whether you actually create lasting change or just cycle through another false start is not whether this interruption will happen. It absolutely will. The question is what you do when it inevitably does. Most people experience this moment as failure. They were doing the thing, building momentum, and now they're not. Which means they failed. Which means they should probably give up and accept that change isn't actually possible for them. But this interpretation misses something fundamental about how change actually works after 45. The interruption isn't evidence that the system doesn't work. It's evidence that you're alive and living in a real world with real demands and real complications. Whether you'll be interrupted isn't the question. The actual question is whether you have a strategy for what to do when you are. Here's what actually happens to people who build lasting change. They get stuck multiple times. They stop for weeks or months. They lose momentum completely. They feel like they're back at square one. But then something different occurs to them. Instead of interpreting the interruption as permanent failure, they interpret it as temporary disruption. And instead of trying to return to exactly where they were, completing the same number of small wins at the same intensity, they start smaller, do something tiny, reconnect, and then do it again. This gradual re-engagement is where most people actually get stuck a second time, not during the initial interruption, but during the attempted recovery. Most motivation advice completely misses this critical distinction. When you get stuck, you don't need to return to your system at full force. You need to return at a micro level. Maybe you were building small wins 3 times a week. Well, for now, commit to one small win in the next 2 days. Maybe you were working for 45 minutes per session. For now, 15 minutes is enough. Maybe you had an entire routine and structure. For now, just one action, just one small thing. The point isn't to make up for lost time or to prove that you're serious about this. The point is to reconnect with the practice at a scale that's actually achievable right now. Think about what's true when you're stuck. You're probably tired. Your energy is depleted. Your attention is fractured. Your confidence in yourself is lower than it was when you were building momentum. These are exactly the conditions where returning to your full system will fail. You'll set it up with good intentions, and then you'll fail to meet those intentions, and you'll spiral further into discouragement. But if instead you ask, what's the smallest possible win I could complete in the next 2 days? Suddenly the question becomes answerable. And when you complete that small win, your nervous system registers something crucial. I can still do this. I didn't actually lose the ability. I just got interrupted. And now I'm reconnecting. What happens next is where people often get stuck again. After completing that first small micro-win, they feel momentum again. Not the strong momentum they had before the interruption, but real momentum nonetheless. And they get excited. They think, okay, I'm back on track. Let me return to my full system. They jump back to 3 small wins per week, or to 45-minute sessions, or to the full structure they had before. And then life happens again. Or they burn out from the intensity. Or they just get fatigued, trying to go from micro scale back to full scale all at once. This is where many people actually lose the practice entirely. Not during the interruption, but during the attempted recovery from the interruption. Instead, the approach that actually works is gradual rebuilding rather than sudden ramp-up. After you've completed a few micro-wins, let's say 3 or 4 over a week or 2, then you can slightly increase the intensity. Maybe from 1 small win every 2 days to 1 small win every 2 days, plus 1 additional small win once during the week. Not a return to your full system, a gentle increase. Then after a few more weeks at this slightly higher intensity, you can increase again, gradually returning to where you were, rather than jumping back all at once. This rebuild process is actually where something interesting happens that people often miss. When you rebuild slowly and deliberately, you often find that you need less structure than you thought you did. What felt essential before the interruption sometimes feels optional now. What you thought you needed 3 times per week sometimes works fine at twice per week. You're not compromising. You're learning what your actual minimum viable system is. The system that you can actually sustain long-term without burning out or abandoning it the moment life gets complicated. And this minimum viable system, smaller than your original system but sustainable in real life. This is actually what creates lasting change. You're also learning something crucial about yourself during this process. That you're resilient, that you can lose momentum and regain it, that being interrupted doesn't erase your capability, that you can recover from disruption. Each time you successfully reconnect after being stuck, you're building evidence that contradicts the belief that failure is permanent. You're building evidence that disruption is survivable. And this evidence is what actually creates genuine confidence, not confidence that things will always go smoothly, but confidence that you can handle it when they don't. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Small Wins. In the end, this isn't really about being more successful or wealthier or more accomplished by conventional measures after you turn 55. This isn't about building an empire or achieving recognition or proving something to people who doubted you. The real transformation that happens when you understand that the psychology of quiet progress is something more fundamental and more personal. It's about building a life where you see yourself as someone who is still growing, who is still capable of change, who is still becoming rather than merely existing within the constraints of who you've already been. And this shift in how you see yourself becomes the foundation for everything else that follows. What happens when you spend months or years building small wins in service of something that matters to you is that your entire relationship with possibility shifts. Early in this process, you might doubt whether you can actually do this. You might complete your first small win and think it was just luck or an exception or a moment when conditions aligned. But as small wins accumulate, one in the first week, then another, then a series of them, something changes in your nervous system. Your brain starts to build a different narrative about what's possible for someone like you. Not someone younger, not someone with different circumstances, someone exactly like you at this particular age, with these particular constraints and capabilities. And it turns out that person is capable of more than you thought. This shift in self-perception is where real change becomes sustainable. You're not motivating yourself through willpower or through constant affirmations or through discipline that requires you to override your own resistance. You're building a lived experience of your own capability. Each small win is a data point that your brain can reference when doubt creeps in. Each completed project or learned skill or difficult conversation or goal achieved becomes part of how you understand yourself. And over time, these accumulate into a solid foundation of evidence that you're someone who can create change in your own life. The legacy of small wins extends beyond just your own life, though that alone would be reason enough to pursue them. There's something that happens when people around you, your children, your partner, your friends, people in your community, watch you show up consistently to something that matters to you. They watch you fail and keep going. They watch you adjust and try again. They watch you rebuild after disruption. They see that you're not waiting for perfect conditions. They see that you're not giving up when things get hard. And something shifts in how they think about possibility for themselves. You become walking proof that growth doesn't have an age limit. You become evidence that change is possible even when circumstances are complicated. You become someone who models something that our culture desperately needs to see more of. Adults who are still becoming. Think about the impact this has across generations. If you're 50 years old and you decide to pursue something genuinely new, you learn to code, you write a novel, you shift careers, you develop a skill you've always been curious about. Your children don't just see a parent trying something new. They internalize a message about what's possible at different ages. If they watch you do this through the accumulation of small wins rather than through one dramatic gesture, they learn something even more valuable. They learn that sustainable change comes from showing up consistently to something that matters, not from waiting for external conditions to align perfectly. This is the legacy that doesn't show up in resume or portfolios. This is the legacy that actually shapes how the next generation thinks about their own possibility. Ray Kroc's legacy isn't just McDonald's as a business. It's also the message that becomes part of the world's consciousness, that you can start something genuinely significant in your 50s. Julia Child's legacy isn't just her cooking or her television shows. It's the living proof that expertise and mastery can develop, even when you start later in life than you thought you should. Morgan Freeman's legacy isn't just his filmography. It's the decades he spent in theater before film success, showing that consistent work in service of your craft matters even when it's happening in obscurity. These lives become templates for what's possible. They become evidence that shifts what people believe about their own futures. When you build a life through small wins after 45, you're not just changing your own circumstances. You're participating in a kind of quiet revolution against the narrative that says life is largely determined by your 20s and 30s, that your potential is mostly spent by midlife, that real transformation requires you to be younger or different or have circumstances you don't actually have. You're proving through your own life that this narrative is incomplete. You're showing through your lived experience that quiet progress, accumulated over time through small choices made consistently, can actually add up to something real and meaningful and lasting. The final piece of this legacy is something deeply personal. It's about dying knowing that you didn't leave your authentic potential completely unexplored. It's about looking back and seeing a thread of growth that continued throughout your life, that didn't end at 35 or 40 or 50. It's about knowing that you tried, that you showed up, that you built something, not necessarily something the world would recognize or celebrate, but something real that matters to you. That you became someone you wouldn't have become if you'd waited for perfect conditions or spent your time only maintaining what you'd already built. This is the quiet legacy of small wins.